Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Marc-Antoine Carrera da Cruz, and I am the new Sensenelec project manager in charge of railway standardization. I have the pleasure to welcome you in this brand new series of podcasts dedicated to harmonized standards in the rail sector. European railway standardization is at a crossing road with a new standardization request, new rules of assessment for harmonized standards, and a new template of Annex ZA, ZZ for harmonized standard. Working group experts responsible for the development of harmonized standards face growing challenge and requirements due to the evolution of the legal framework surrounding harmonized standards and the way it affects the assessment process of harmonized standards. In this context, the role of the Annex ZA, the matrix used in the harmonized standard to allow the linkage between the clauses of the standard and the European railway legislation, is become crucial. Consequently, the quality of the drafting of this Annex ZA is highly scrutinized and is a key factor in the decision of accepting the standard in the European legislation. As the requirements on the quality of drafting of this annex are stronger, there is a growing need of explanation on what is the new yardstick for this annex and what is the methodology to follow in order to reach a proper drafting in line with this yardstick. This requires dedicated training through an adequate pedagogy. This series of podcasts is intended to the experts working on the development of railways harmonized standards. It provides the necessary background, explanation, and training to apply a proper way of preparing a good annex when drafting an harmonized standard. It is organized in 4 sessions, allowing to tackle both the framework and the practical points to consider when preparing harmonized standards. The first session is dedicated to the European Commission explanation of the global legal framework, the system of assessment, and the legislation. The second session focuses specifically on the TSI. The TSI are the European regulation that support the European Directive of Railways interoperability. And the second session identifies the place of harmonized standards in the TSI. The third session introduces the methodology to follow when preparing the Annex ZA. And finally, the fourth session will be a practical simulation and explanation of how to draft the Annex ZA. So today we have the pleasure to welcome Geoff Mather, presenting the 4th session. This 4th session will explain how to deal with the Annex ZA drafting with a practical case. So let me introduce our speaker of the day. Geoff Mather undertook London University degree in mechanical engineering and received honours degree. He started at British Rail Research Track and Structures Department in 1967 and had been involved in numerous important railway projects. Recruited in 1984 by British Rail Engineering Limited as head of development testing to set up a completely new testing capability and facility, he became one of the British mechanical engineer on the first Eurostar project team based in France between 1988 and 1989. He has been successively troubleshooting engineer on tilting trains, new bogie development project team leader, and engineering director working in Germany, Sweden, France, and UK. Appointed chief engineer in 1989, he became involved in railway standardization, first in CENTIC 256 Working Group 11 as UK expert from 1992 to 1997, and then has CENTIC 256 Subcommittee 2 Chairman since November 1997. So, Geoff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark Antoine. Today, we're going to talk about how to create an Annex ZA. Because I'm in the rolling stock division, I'm more interested, of course, in the mechanical engineering side, but the process is absolutely identical for producing an Annex ZA in the TC9X situation as well. So today, I'm going to use an example of assessing the relationship compatibility between a new or indeed a revised standard and the new TSIs to produce this Annex ZA. The example that I'm using is a recent revision of EN 13749, which is to do with the method of specifying the structural requirements of bogie frames. So whenever you start this process to produce an Annex ZA for technical specifications, for either ENs, new ENs or EN revisions, whatever you do, start the process as early as possible. Ensure that you, the creator, for example, the convener, or it could be members of your working group, are fully aware of the standardization requirements. For example, we sometimes have standardization requests or the request that comes from the national standard bodies, etc. And believe me, this will make it easy for you to format the standard and create the Annex ZAs. Taking the example of a revision at the beginning, and you'll see that the process remains the same whether it's a new EN or a revision in the next few slides. I find that it's useful to check the Annex ZA content for the original published EN, the clauses and the relationships to the original TSI's requirements. You can do this to appreciate the original rationale that was used in making the connection between the TSI and the EN. Because this is important, it may have changed, that is to say the TSI, for the revision at the time that you're doing it. This is to kind of stimulate the thought process for you and sort of encourage you to appreciate the situation. And this is important, even if you were the original convener that wrote the standard, excuse me, or you are a new convener or a member of the working group. But whatever you do, do not copy the original Annex ZA into the new template because things have to be looked at more carefully. So again, for an EN revision, check if the latest editions of the TSIs still have the same requirements. They may have less, but it might be unlikely, or they may have more. So it gives you a feel as to what the original starting point was for that first EN, as opposed to what you're now being asked to do for the latest updates of the TSIs. What you then need to do is identify the relevant requirement clause or appendix of the TSIs and for which clauses and or annexes of your new EN or even the revised EN revision that satisfy the TSI requirements. So as you can see, for EN XXX and the new edition of the TSI freight in this case and TSI lock and pass, you look at what clauses are matching the TSI. Now, this is the key for me in how to create the TSI EN relationship. For each TSI Annex ZA, and I say each because in this particular example I'm using for the bogies, we actually had to have compatibility with the freight wagon TSI and the lock and pass. So this is just showing an example of the freight wagons. So what you produce is what we call a table of matching clauses for TSIs and the new EN or the EN revision. And this can be used by the HES consultant in their assessment. and it's very, very useful and very important. You can use Excel or Word, and even though I'll explain the columns in a moment, you can see just two examples. The chapter 4231 of the TSI, it was associated with gauging, and the headline text is as says in the text in the TSI. You then look in the standard and you find that clause 4.4, vehicle conditions and interfaces, has some references to gauging. So the comment, which is the working group or the convener's comment in the Annex ZA-1 column, is, as gauging requirements are mentioned here, include reference to clause 4.4. So that's the proposal. And when the consultant saw it, he says, yep, I agree. Relevant clauses of the 15827, which are referred there, shall be added in clause 4.4. You look at the second one, 42361, structural design of the bogie frame. Tells you the requirements, and in the assessment, it was felt, in Annex C, we've got some loads due to bogie running, so this clause C1 and C3 is useful. And in Annex D, there's some clauses D1, D4, and D6. And the statement was, these additional references give more definition of the integrity requirements of the bogie. So the proposal was, comment, include these additional clauses to 6.2, which is already defined in the TSI. So the proposal is to write in the column in the Annex ZA, clause 6.2, Annex C, clauses C1 to C3, and Annex D, and those clauses. But when the consultant saw it, he says, no, I don't agree with that proposal, because clause 6.2 of the EN is mandatory. And so therefore, because clause 6.2 already refers to Annexes C and Annex D, you don't have to go into any more definition. So as you can see, it was a good sort of indication as to what you wanted to do, and gave the consultant an opportunity to say, I see what you're saying, but yes, I agree on this, but I recommend that you don't do that. So just to sort of summarize what that table is, because this is quite important, the first two columns describe the relevant TSI and the requirement clause. The third column describes the TSI clause title. The fourth describes the TSI clause requirement in more detail. The fifth column is what you're working on particularly, and it describes the working group view, or the convener's view, on which EN clause or clauses, or even annexes, satisfy the TSI requirement. And so the sixth column summarizes what you are proposing to put in, which clauses or annexes are to go in the Annex ZA that you consider meet the TSI requirement. And finally, the seventh column is used by the HAS consultant for their comments. Now, following that discussion with the HAS consultant, or you may have to have further iterations, which actually happened in this case of the proposals until we reached agreement, from this sort of final agreed table of matching clauses, the final Annex ZA or ZAs tables can be produced. And this is just a snapshot of the Annex ZA, which was finally agreed with the consultant. And this is the new format. I'll draw your attention to the note at the top of this table, where it says the technical specification for interoperability may refer to other clauses of this standard, making the application of those clauses mandatory. That's very key. Possible references to such clauses are found in the Appendix D to the TSI. Appendix D, because it's associated with the freight wagon. The other Annex ZA for this particular standard revision, ZA2, was for lock and pass. So instead of Annex D, it was, Appendix D, it was Appendix J. So if Appendix D or Appendix J refer to clauses in your standard, you don't have to put them in this table as you used to do in the past. And so that made it quite nice and simple in this revision for the standard that we only ended up with these two clauses, one for gauging, one for environmental conditions, and the rest was already mandated by Appendix D and its references therein. So that was quite useful. So finally, once you've got that agreement from the table of comments, you've produced your new Annex ZA, and in this case for the revision ZA2 as well, you can insert those tables into your draft. And of course, those Annex ZA show the presumption of conformity against the latest edition of the TSIs. Sounds short and simple, but it becomes more simple if you follow that process and if you use that table of comments. I highly recommend it. If you need more information, as you may or may not have seen in the other podcast before, it should be available to you in these links in the SENBOS or Senelec BOS and this series of podcasts for your information in that link at the bottom. I hope you found this useful. Thank you.